You can join in too on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, vehicle regos and even the fuel excise could be scrapped and replaced with what's being described as a user pays road system, or in other words, lots of tolls. A report by Infrastructure Australia recommends charging drivers to use roads in a bid to cut traffic congestion. The Turnbull government says it'll consider the idea, but any changes will be at least 10 years away and would have to be combined with better public transport.
This broader recommendation about vehicle charging more generally, road pricing more generally, is one of the recommendations that we'll look at. We'll study it. Obviously, we have said that this is something that would, if it were to be proceeded with, is at least a 10-year journey.
There are some areas of our cities where public transport is relatively plentiful. Say in the inner city areas of Sydney, where my city, where Paul and I live. There is public transport is very good in some areas. In other areas, it's almost completely absent. Clearly, a more calibrated, better calibrated user pay system has some attractions, but it obviously has to be done, as with any of our policies, in a way that is equitable and is fair.
So is sending a price signal like extra road tolls a good way to cut congestion and pollution for that matter? Or Sabine, is it a bit of an unfair slug on people who have to drive long distances just to get to their work?
Well, I mean, that'd kind of depend on how it was implemented, right? But, I mean, in theory, I'm not actually opposed to the idea. And I'm going to preface this by saying I don't actually drive. I live in the inner city. I have multiple trams at my doorstep that take me right to my office. But, you know, there's really no need for someone like me who does live in that area to ever have to drive a car into the city. So, like I said, I'm not particularly opposed to it. I'll give you the example of my partner, right? He drives his car because he can, even though he also works in the city and has multiple trams on his doorstep that can take him right to his office door. If there were a price signal that incentivised him to maybe leave the car at home, I actually don't. I suspect that he would actually take the tram or walk.
do you think, John Delabosco, I mean, they're talking about a price signal here, but of course if you get rid of the fuel excise, petrol goes down presumably 39 cents a litre straight away. That's hardly likely to drive consumption down, I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah, that's I think that tells you that the toll system that would effectively be the congestion regulation would have to be very, very steep indeed to compensate for the cut to the petrol excise. I think also the other thing about this is I think Sabine's right. The in principle point here is this is a good idea. The problem is that the public transport system, which the Prime Minister actually referred to, is very unequally and unfairly distributed throughout our major cities, and of course is almost non-existent in a lot of regions. And I don't think it could make up that deficit in 10 years, and 10 years is a very long time.
And I guess the other thing that always comes up, if you're looking at putting extra tolls on roads, then of course you're putting extra costs on transport, which means extra costs on groceries and pretty much everything, and we all end up paying, one way or the other.
And for that and many other reasons, tolls are inherently unpopular, as anybody who's done some political research will tell you.
But of course, Mark, politicians are trying to find ways to fund infrastructure, and it seems still the most attractive way to do that is to get, private companies to build roads, build rail lines even, and there is the demand for these things, so should we be prepared to pay for them, even if it's going to cost us more?
I think in a city like Sydney, we've got a great example of when you try to incentivise or you try to get private companies in to build roads, it can also fail miserably. We saw that with the Cross City Tunnel in Sydney, and we've seen it in multiple times that where private companies have tried to be contracted in and build this huge millions and millions of dollars worth of infrastructure. But I think that the issue here is that it's a good idea. In practice, it'll never work. Politicians will never accept it because we're talking about people who use the road the most. And in a lot of the times, we're talking about people who are trying to drive in from very, very marginal seats. And I can tell you now, the state government is going to have none of this federal oversight in trying to implement more tolls across cities to actually, bring in more revenue when a lot of the times the people coming in are actually those voters that they want to actually keep and not drive away. way.
Yeah, Sabine, also in this, I mean, there's about 80 recommendations. It wasn't just about road and rail and so on. There was even a suggestion that in the medium term, the national broadband network should be sold into private hands. What did you make of that? I mean, what's the point of the government and taxpayers building this thing and then just flogging it off later?
Well, that kind of should have been the question 5 years ago. But look, I mean, we're in a really interesting situation at the moment whereby if we believe the hype, then there is a massive funding shortfall to come. And, you know, there's a shortfall in funding for the NDIS, there's a shortfall in funding for the NBN. Previous government did sort of post-weight a lot of these major infrastructure projects so that the costs were not readily apparent. So I do think that the government's going to have a massive issue on its hands. And, you know, I do think that it's time to come up with some creative ways of actually funding all of these infrastructure projects. But I guess as with anything, it's the sales job and it's the communications job that will really determine whether or not voters